Daniel Keene being connected to Salvador Quinn sounds almost impossible at first. Daniel is living in the before times, when the world still exists and the silos are only being planned. Salvador Quinn belongs to Silo 18's distant history, roughly 140 years before Bernard Holland's time. By the chronology we've been given, those two men should be separated by centuries of history. And yet, Season 3 has started putting Daniel in exactly the part of the story where a connection to Quinn would matter most. That is why this theory deserves a closer look. We already know Salvador Quinn was one of the most important people in Silo 18's history. He was the head of IT during the rebellion about 140 years before the main story. His name became associated with the destruction of books, the loss of knowledge, and the mass use of vitamin D+. Generations of residents were taught that Quinn had effectively destroyed their history. Then Lucas discovered the truth. Quinn had found something hidden beneath the silo. He discovered the existence of the larger silo system. He left behind a coded message because he knew that someone, eventually, would find it. That message became one of the biggest cracks in the official story. And now Season 3 has taken us back to the beginning, where Daniel Keene is getting closer to the people who created that entire system. Apple's official description of Season 3 specifically says Daniel and journalist Helen Drew are investigating a conspiracy in the before times that leads to catastrophic consequences. By episode 8, we've learned that the silos were being constructed as protection against a nanotechnology catastrophe, with Daniel and Helen being brought into the project and then trying to escape from it. So the show has deliberately put Daniel at the birth of the silo system. Quinn, meanwhile, was one of the people who later discovered what that system really was. That creates three possibilities. Daniel could literally become Salvador Quinn. Daniel could become connected to Quinn through the creation of Silo 18, or Daniel could be one of the original people whose actions eventually produced the person history remembers as Salvador Quinn. The first option is the wild one, and fans have already started noticing it. There are current fan discussions proposing that Daniel could somehow become Quinn, especially after the Season 3 material began connecting the before times directly to the later history of Silo 18. The theory gets much stranger when you look at the names. Daniel Keene, Salvador Quinn. There is no confirmed connection between those names. Nothing in the show has established that Daniel adopted the Quinn identity, so I would not treat the name similarity as evidence by itself. But there is another reason people are making the connection. Daniel is being positioned around the same knowledge that eventually destroyed Quinn's reputation. Daniel is learning how the silos were created. He is learning why they were built. He is learning that the people constructing them have plans for humanity that go far beyond simply hiding underground. And he is becoming involved at the exact moment when the technology, political structure, and secrecy behind the silos are being established. If Daniel survives the transition into the silo system, he could potentially know more about its original purpose than almost anyone living inside Silo 18 generations later. That is exactly the kind of person who could eventually become Quinn. But there is a huge problem. The timeline. Salvador Quinn lived roughly 140 years before Bernard. Daniel's story takes place centuries before Juliet's story. So, a literal Daniel to Quinn identity requires the show to explain how Daniel survives long enough to become a man from Silo 18's later history. And Season 3 has already introduced one possible answer: memory, suspended time, advanced medical technology. The entire season has been obsessed with controlling what people remember and how long they remain alive. Charlotte's story established that memory manipulation existed before the silos were fully operational. Juliet's story shows that the technology continued for centuries. The silo system itself was eventually built around people being kept ignorant of their history. That makes longevity technology a much more reasonable possibility than it would have been at the beginning of the series. We also know the show's source material contains a mechanism for people from the early Silo era to survive far into the future through cryogenic suspension. The television adaptation has already changed major details from the books, including Daniel's identity and his relationship with Helen, so book chronology cannot automatically tell us what the show will do with him. That distinction matters. This theory is about the show, And the show has already demonstrated that it is willing to rearrange the mythology. The bigger clue may actually be Quinn's role rather than his name. Think about what Quinn did. He discovered that the silo was part of a system of 50 silos. He discovered that another silo had the power to kill everyone inside Silo 18. He realized that ordinary knowledge could trigger another rebellion. And he responded by destroying information and introducing vitamin D plus into the water. It was an awful decision, but Quinn believed it was necessary to prevent the safeguard from being activated. That means Quinn wasn't simply a dictator who wanted control. He was someone who had learned enough about the system to become terrified of what would happen if the population understood it. That sounds very different from the version of Quinn remembered by ordinary residents. And Daniel is now moving toward exactly that kind of knowledge. He has seen the people behind the Silo project. He knows the outside world was facing a technological threat. He has discovered that the public story surrounding the catastrophe is full of manipulation. He has been pulled into a project where information itself is treated as dangerous. That is the foundation of Quinn's later behavior. There is another detail I think matters even more. The show has made memory loss a bridge between the before times and the Silo era. Charlotte loses access to her identity. Juliet loses access to her memories. The people of Silo 18 eventually lose generations of historical knowledge. And Quinn becomes the person who deliberately causes a massive memory erasure event. That creates a strange possibility. What if Daniel isn't simply the person who becomes Quinn? What if Daniel helps create the conditions that produce Quinn? Maybe Daniel discovers that the Silo population cannot be allowed to remember the outside world. Maybe he learns something about the safeguard that makes ordinary historical knowledge dangerous. Maybe the people running the system force him into a role where preserving humanity means controlling what humanity remembers. That would give Quinn's actions a completely different meaning. The man remembered as a villain could have been carrying out an idea that originated with the people who built the silos. And Daniel could be one of those people. There is already a precedent for this kind of moral reversal in the story. Silo repeatedly gives us a character who appears to be protecting the system, then reveals that they were responding to information we didn't have. Bernard is the obvious example. He believed he was protecting Silo 18. Then he discovered that the people above him had the power to destroy it. Quinn may have gone through something similar. He found the hidden truth. He understood the danger. Then he made a terrible choice. That is why Daniel's current storyline matters so much. He is standing at the beginning of the same chain. And the question becomes whether the Daniel we are watching will eventually become another person entirely. Because if Daniel Keene really does become Salvador Quinn, there is one massive clue the show would need to explain. Why Silo 18? Why would a man involved in the creation of the entire Silo project eventually end up becoming the head of IT in one particular silo? That question may lead somewhere even stranger. Silo 18 has already shown us that people from the earliest days of the project can leave traces that survive for generations. The Pez dispenser is the obvious example. Daniel gives Helen the duck Pez dispenser in the before times. That same object eventually becomes part of Juliet's story. The showrunner has confirmed that this is the same relic, meaning the series has deliberately planted a physical object that crosses the enormous gap between Daniel's world and Juliet's. So the writers have already established a storytelling rule. Things from Daniel's life can survive into Silo 18. Objects can survive. Information can survive. And potentially, people can survive. That makes the Daniel Quinn theory much more interesting than a simple, the name sounds similar idea. Daniel is being connected to Silo 18 through the mythology of the show itself. The question is what else he leaves behind. Maybe it is the Pez dispenser. Maybe it is information. Maybe it is a system. Or maybe it is Daniel himself. There is also the possibility that the Daniel Quinn connection is indirect. This might actually be the version I find more believable right now. Daniel may help design or understand the system that Quinn later inherits. Remember, Daniel is being brought into the project during the period when the silos are being created. By episode 8, Per Stenson has explained that the plan involves 50 silos designed to preserve humanity after a nanotechnology catastrophe. If Daniel remains involved long enough, he could learn the rules governing the silos. He could know about the safeguard before anyone living underground has even heard the word. He could know why communication between silos is dangerous. He could know why information has to be restricted. And if the people in charge eventually disappear, Daniel's knowledge could be passed down through the people responsible for IT. That would make Quinn the inheritor of Daniel's knowledge rather than Daniel himself. And there is a nice thematic connection there. Daniel starts out investigating the truth. Quinn ends up hiding the truth. That is a very Silo kind of character arc. A person begins by asking questions, discovers what the system is capable of, and eventually decides that the truth itself is too dangerous for ordinary people to possess. The problem is that we don't know whether Daniel will actually make that choice. He and Helen have already shown resistance to the people controlling the project. Episode 8 leaves them trying to escape after learning what the silos are for. So, if Daniel eventually becomes Quinn, something has to change. And that change could be the missing piece of the theory. Maybe Daniel learns that there is a second layer to the silo plan. The stated purpose is survival, but the actual system may require control. That distinction has been sitting underneath the entire show. The silos were built to preserve humanity, but the people inside them are subjected to memory manipulation, restricted information, surveillance, and the safeguard. Quinn discovers the same contradiction generations later. He learns that Silo 18 is protected by a system that can also destroy it. And his response is to make sure the residents never learn enough to threaten that system. If Daniel experiences that realization firsthand, then Quinn's actions stop looking like an isolated historical event. They become part of a philosophy that began with the founders. There is another reason I wouldn't completely dismiss the literal identity theory. Season 3 has already made Daniel's survival unusually important. The show's official material describes him as part of the origin story of the Silo system, and Ashley Zuckerman has teased that Season 3 keeps recontextualizing what viewers think is happening. That is exactly the kind of language that makes a theory like this worth keeping alive. Still, the evidence for Daniel literally becoming Quinn remains weak. The timeline needs an explanation. The show has not said Daniel changes his name. It has not shown him entering cryogenic suspension. It has not established that he will live for centuries. And there is no confirmed link between Daniel Keene and Salvador Quinn. Those are major gaps. There is also a simpler possibility. The writers may have introduced Daniel because his story is meant to explain the origins of the Silo system, while Quinn exists to show what happened when that system was eventually understood from the inside. In that version, the two characters are connected by history. Daniel helps create the conditions. Quinn discovers the consequences. That would still make Daniel incredibly important to Quinn's story without requiring a secret identity twist. And honestly, that may fit the show's structure better. The strongest connection between them may be knowledge. Daniel is learning the original truth. Quinn later discovers part of that truth again. Both men occupy the same dangerous position. They know more about the silo system than ordinary residents are supposed to know. The difference is what each man does with that knowledge. Daniel is still trying to expose it. Quinn eventually hides it. That creates a fascinating question for the remaining story. What happens to Daniel after he realizes what the silos actually are? If he becomes one of the people responsible for maintaining them, the Daniel Quinn theory gets much stronger. If he disappears from the historical record, that disappearance becomes suspicious. And if the show gives us any evidence that Daniel survives into the early generations of the silos, then the theory suddenly becomes much more serious. There is also the possibility that the name Salvador Quinn itself is important for another reason. Quinn's reputation survived for generations, even though the real reason behind his actions was hidden. That means the show needs a way to connect the man we see in the before times with the man later remembered in Silo 18. Daniel would be a perfect candidate because the audience already knows him. We would watch him make decisions in the present-day storyline, then eventually recognize the consequences centuries later. That kind of reveal would fit Silo's obsession with history. The characters think they are discovering someone else's past. Then they realize the past belongs to people we've already been watching. For now, though, I would rank the possibilities like this. Daniel literally becoming Salvador Quinn is the most exciting version, but it needs the most explanation. Daniel becoming the origin of Quinn's ideas is much easier to support. Daniel leaving behind information that eventually reaches Quinn is probably the safest interpretation. And there is one final possibility I would keep on the table. Daniel may be connected to Quinn through the people who control the silos. If Daniel learns the truth about the project and becomes part of the machinery that manages the survivors, his influence could continue without his physical survival. His decisions could become policy. His discoveries could become classified knowledge. His methods could eventually be inherited by IT. That would make Salvador Quinn the product of Daniel's world. And that might be the point. The show has spent 3 seasons asking how humanity went from a functioning civilization to 50 underground silos ruled by secrecy. Daniel Keene is finally showing us the beginning of that process. Salvador Quinn showed us what happened when someone inside that system discovered the truth. Put those two stories together, and the connection becomes hard to ignore. Maybe Daniel becomes Quinn. Maybe Quinn becomes Daniel's successor. Maybe Quinn is simply the man who eventually finds the same truth Daniel once knew. We don't have enough evidence